The small cabin sat at the edge of Willow Creek, its wooden walls weathered by seasons of rain and sun. Inside, a girl of 12 years slept beneath a patchwork quilt, her breath making tiny clouds in the cold morning air. The fire had died during the night, leaving only gray ashes in the stone hearth. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples. Annie opened her eyes before the rooster crowed. This was her way. She had learned long ago that rising early meant quiet moments to herself before the busy day began. She swung her feet to the rough wooden floor and quickly pulled on her worn boots. The spring air still carried winter's bite, especially in the early hours. 5 years had passed since the fever took her parents. 5 years of moving from home to home in the small settlement of Willow Creek. The people were kind enough. They fed her, clothed her, gave her a place to sleep. But Annie belonged to everyone and no one. She did chores for the miller's wife on Mondays, helped the blacksmith's family on Tuesdays, worked at the general store on Wednesdays, and so it went through the week. Each night she slept in a different bed. Better than an orphanage back east, the townsfolk would say when newcomers asked about the quiet girl with the serious eyes. Here, she's part of the community. And she was, in a way. But Annie knew the difference between being part of something and truly belonging to it. She saw it in the way mothers smoothed their children's hair, the way fathers lifted their little ones onto strong shoulders. She was cared for, but not cherished, fed, but not fussed over. The distinction lived in her heart like a small, hard stone. Annie splashed cold water on her face from the basin and quickly braided her hair. Today she would stay with the Coopers, which meant tending to their chickens and helping Mrs. Cooper with the washing. Not her favorite tasks, but the Coopers had a baby who sometimes fell asleep in Annie's arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers. Those moments made the soap-chapped hands worth it. She slipped out the door of the Tanner family's cabin, careful not to wake anyone. The path to the Coopers would take her past her favorite spot, the river bend where tall willows trailed their branches in the flowing water. If she hurried, she might have a few precious minutes there before her day of work began. The settlement was quiet at this hour, with only a few chimney plumes rising against the lightening sky. Annie knew every path and shortcut, every house and barn. Willow Creek had been her entire world for all of her 12 years. Her parents had come west as young people seeking land and opportunity. They had found both, building a small homestead and planting an orchard of apple trees that had just begun to bear fruit when the sickness came. The apples still grew, though the cabin and land now belonged to a new family who had arrived last autumn. Annie sometimes slipped into the orchard when no one was looking, just to sit beneath the trees her father had planted. She didn't take any apples. That would be stealing. She just needed to remember. The morning dew soaked the hem of her dress as Annie cut across the meadow that separated the main settlement from the river. She could hear the water before she saw it, a gentle rushing sound that always made her feel a little less alone. The river was constant, always moving yet always there, unlike people who could be taken away in the space of a few fevered days. As the trees thinned, the river came into view, its surface catching the early light in flashes of gold. Annie slowed, her steps savoring the approach to her special place. Here, where the river curved and the bank widened into a small sandy beach, she could pretend the world was hers alone. She settled onto her favorite rock, a flat stone worn smooth by countless seasons of rushing water. Pulling her knees up to her chest, she watched a family of ducks make their way downstream. The mother in front, 5 ducklings paddling furiously behind. "You're lucky," she whispered to them. "You still have each other." The ducks paid her no mind, disappearing around the river bend. Annie sighed and picked up a small stone, tossing it into the water. She liked the way the ripples spread out, growing wider and wider until they faded away. Sometimes she imagined her life was like that, the small splash of her existence creating ripples that would eventually disappear, leaving the surface smooth again, as if she had never been there at all. But on her better days, Annie chose to believe she could make ripples that mattered. Her teacher, Miss Hart, had told her she was the brightest student in the school, with a gift for numbers and letters alike. "You could be a teacher someday," Miss Hart had said, her eyes serious behind her spectacles. Or perhaps even more. Those words had planted a seed in Annie's heart. Maybe she could be more than just the orphan of Willow Creek. Maybe she could make ripples that would reach far beyond this small settlement. A snap of a twig brought her attention back to the present. Annie turned quickly, half expecting to see Mrs. Cooper coming to scold her for dawdling. Instead, she saw nothing but the swaying branches of the willows and the tall grass rustling in the morning breeze. Still, she had the odd feeling of being watched. "Hello?" she called, her voice small against the sound of the flowing river. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but Annie couldn't shake the prickly feeling at the back of her neck. She'd heard the grown-ups talking in low voices lately about missing tools and footprints found around the edges of fields. Some blamed wolves or bears. Others whispered about the native tribe that lived beyond the ridge to the west. Annie had never seen any of the native people up close. Sometimes traders came through town with stories of encounters, some friendly, others not. The settlement's men kept rifles loaded and taught their sons to shoot. Their daughters were told to stay close to home, but Annie had no father to keep her close, and her curiosity often outweighed her caution. More than once, she'd wandered, farther than she should, drawn by the mystery of the lands beyond Willow Creek. She'd found arrowheads in the dirt, and once, a beautiful feather decorated with tiny beads that she kept hidden in a small box beneath the floorboard of the schoolhouse, her one secret treasure. A fish jumped upstream, the splash drawing her eyes back to the water. The sun had risen higher now, burning away the morning mist. Annie knew she should get going. Mrs. Cooper would be expecting her, and the baby would be fussing for his breakfast. With a last look at her peaceful spot, she stood and brushed off her dress. As she turned to go, something on the opposite bank caught her eye, a flash of color different from the greens and browns of the forest. She squinted, trying to make it out. For just a moment, she thought she saw a face among the trees, dark eyes watching her from beneath a fringe of black hair. Then it was gone, like a dream upon waking. Annie stood frozen, her heart beating faster. Had someone been watching her all this time? One of the native people the adults spoke of with such fear and suspicion? She should be afraid, she knew. She should run back to the settlement and tell someone what she'd seen. But instead, a strange feeling of excitement fluttered in her chest. For years, she'd felt invisible to most of the town, just another task to be handled, another mouth to feed. The thought that someone had actually seen her, had been interested enough to watch her, filled her with an unexpected warmth. She raised her hand slowly, a tentative wave to whoever might still be watching from the shadows. Then, hugging this new secret to herself like a precious gift, Annie turned and hurried toward the Cooper house, her mind full of dark eyes and possibilities. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of something new. Not quite hope, but perhaps its beginning. A sense that the story of her life might hold more than endless chores and pitying glances, more than the safe, small boundaries of Willow Creek. As she approached the settlement, Annie slowed her steps, forcing her face back into its usual calm mask. But inside, something had shifted. The river had always been her special place, her escape. Now it had become something more. A boundary between her world and another, a place where different lives might touch like ripples spreading across the water. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to the river. And maybe, just maybe, she would not be alone. The next day, Annie woke with the same flutter of excitement in her chest. All through her chores at the Cooper's house, her mind kept drifting to the river and the mysterious eyes she'd glimpsed through the trees. Mrs. Cooper had scolded her twice for daydreaming, once when she nearly let the bread burn and again when she poured water on the floor instead of into the washing tub. "Got your head in the clouds today, child?" Mrs. Cooper asked, not unkindly, as she handed Annie a rag to mop up the spill. "Sorry, ma'am," Annie mumbled, her cheeks growing warm. "No harm done," Mrs. Cooper said with a sigh. "But do try to stay with us here on Earth. Dreaming doesn't get the washing done." But dreaming was what kept Annie going through the long day, of scrubbing clothes and hanging them to dry, of feeding chickens and sweeping floors. She dreamed of returning to the river, of maybe catching another glimpse of whoever had been watching her. By the time the sun began its slow slide toward the western hills, Annie had finished her chores. Mrs. Cooper pressed a small bundle into her hands, leftover cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. "For your supper," she said. "You're staying with the Millers tonight, yes?" Annie nodded. The Millers lived at the far edge of town, which meant she could take the path along the river to get there. Her heart beat a little faster at the thought. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper," she said, tucking the bundle into her pocket. "Off with you then." "And Annie," Mrs. Cooper paused, her face softening. "You did good work today, even with your head in the clouds." Annie felt a small glow at the words. Praise was rare enough in her life to be treasured when it came. With a quick smile, she headed out the door and toward the river path. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the dirt path. Birds called to each other overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped out its rhythmic song. Annie walked quickly, eager to reach her special spot by the river bend. When she arrived, the place looked just as it always did. The smooth rocks, the drooping willows, the water flowing endlessly by. But something felt different. Annie stood very still, her eyes scanning the opposite bank. "I know you're there," she called out, surprised by her own boldness. "I saw you yesterday." For a long moment there was only silence. Then slowly, a figure emerged from between the trees on the far bank. It was a girl, about Annie's age, with long black hair tied in 2 braids. She wore a dress made of some kind of animal skin, decorated with tiny beads that caught the sunlight. But what struck Annie most was the way the girl moved, carefully favoring her right leg. The 2 girls stared at each other across the flowing water, neither one speaking. Annie's heart hammered in her chest. She'd never been this close to one of the native people before. Should she be afraid? The adults in town certainly would tell her to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot, curiosity winning out over fear. The girl on the other side raised her hand in a hesitant greeting, just as Annie had done the day before. Without thinking, Annie raised her own hand in return. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely loud enough to carry over the sound of the rushing water. The girl tilted her head, as if considering whether to respond. Then she pointed to herself and said a word Annie couldn't understand. "Is that your name?" Annie asked, pointing to the girl and then to herself. "I'm Annie." The girl nodded slowly. "Naya," she said, pointing to herself again. Then she gestured to Annie and repeated, "Annie," trying out the unfamiliar sound. A smile spread across Annie's face. They were talking, sort of anyway, but the river stood between them, too wide at this point for conversation. Annie looked upstream, remembering the shallow ford she'd crossed once with Mr. Cooper when helping to search for a lost calf. She pointed in that direction and made a walking motion with her fingers, trying to indicate that Naya should meet her at the crossing. Naya's eyes followed her gesture, but she shook her head, pointing to her injured leg. She couldn't make the walk. Annie bit her lip, thinking, the river was too deep here to cross safely, especially with Naya's bad leg. But Annie couldn't bear to just walk away, not now that they'd made contact. This was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to her in Willow Creek. A fallen log a little ways downstream caught her eye. It stretched nearly all the way across the river, creating a natural bridge. If she could cross there, she could help Naya make it over the shallow part at the end. Annie pointed to the log and pantomimed walking across. Naya's eyes widened and she shook her head vigorously, making a motion like falling into the water. She clearly thought it was too dangerous. Maybe it was. But Annie had balanced on fence rails plenty of times without falling. And the worst that could happen was getting wet, right? Before she could talk herself out of it, she headed for the log. "I'm coming over," she called to Naya, who was still shaking her head. The log was wider than it had looked from a distance, which was good. Still, Annie's heart raced as she put one foot on the rough bark and tested her weight. It seemed solid enough. Taking a deep breath, she began to inch her way across, arms outstretched for balance. The rushing water below made her dizzy if she looked down too long, so she kept her eyes fixed on the far bank, where Naya was now watching with a mixture of alarm and admiration on her face. When Annie was about halfway across, her foot slipped on a patch of moss. For one terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of falling. A small cry escaped her lips as she fought to regain her balance. From the bank, she heard Naya call out something in her language, A warning, perhaps, or encouragement. With a supreme effort, Annie steadied herself and took another careful step. And another. Finally, she reached the far bank, jumping the last short distance to land on solid ground. Naya was staring at her with wide eyes, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just seen. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. She said something in her language and made a gesture like her heart beating very fast. Annie laughed, placing a hand over her own racing heart. "Mine too," she said. They stood there for a moment, smiling at each other. Two girls from different worlds, suddenly finding themselves face to face. Naya pointed to Annie's clothes, to her braided hair, touching her own braids to show the similarity. Annie nodded, then pointed to the beadwork on Naya's dress, making an admiring sound. Carefully, Annie approached and offered her arm for support. Naya hesitated for just a moment before accepting, leaning on Annie as they made their slow way along the bank. When they reached the shallowest part of the river, where the water barely covered the smooth stones of the riverbed, Annie helped Naya step into the cool flow. Together, they crossed the boundary that separated their worlds. The weeks that followed changed everything for Annie. Her days still followed the same pattern: chores at different houses, meals at different tables, sleeping in different beds, but now she had a secret that made her heart light. Whenever she could steal away, she would hurry to the river to meet Naya. They created their own special place where the river curved gently and a small clearing opened among the willows. Hidden from both the settlement and Naya's village, they could spend hours together without fear of being discovered. Annie always brought something small from town: a ribbon, a cookie sneaked from Mrs. Miller's kitchen, or once, a tiny wooden horse that the carpenter had carved and given her as thanks for delivering messages. Naya brought gifts too: a bracelet woven from plant fibers, a small pouch decorated with colorful quills, and knowledge. So much knowledge. She taught Annie how to weave baskets from river reeds, how to identify which plants could heal a fever or stop bleeding, and words from her language. Annie practiced these words carefully, loving the way they felt different in her mouth from the English she'd grown up speaking. In turn, Annie taught Naya words in English and told her stories from the books at school. Naya especially loved the tale of Cinderella, perhaps because she saw something of Annie in the motherless girl who worked hard and dreamed of a different life. On this particular day in late spring, Annie arrived at their meeting spot with news too big to keep inside. "The traders came today," she said breathlessly, as she sat beside Naya on their favorite rock. "They bring news from all over." "And guess what they said?" Naya smiled at Annie's excitement. Her English had improved over their weeks together, though she still spoke carefully, choosing her words. "What news?" she asked, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. "They say there's a new settlement being built to the east, twice as big as Willow Creek, and they need a teacher for the children." Annie's words tumbled out in a rush. "Miss Hart says I could be her assistant when I'm older, and maybe someday I could have my own school. I could go there, Naya. I could be something more than just the orphan girl." Naya's smile faded a little, and Annie immediately regretted her words. She hadn't thought about what this dream would mean: leaving Willow Creek, leaving their secret friendship. "But that's a long time from now," Annie added quickly. "Years and years." Naya nodded, but her eyes had turned thoughtful. She reached into the small bag she always carried and pulled out something wrapped in a soft piece of leather. "I bring special gift today, too," she said, carefully unwrapping the item. Inside lay a necklace, a smooth stone pendant hanging from a leather cord. The stone was a deep blue, like the sky just before full darkness, with a vein of white running through it. "It's beautiful," Annie breathed, reaching out to touch it gently. "My grandmother make it," Naya explained. "She say this stone has spirit." She frowned, searching for the right word. "Power. It protect the one who wear it." She placed the necklace in Annie's hands. "For you." Annie looked up, surprised. "But if your grandmother made it, shouldn't you keep it?" Naya shook her head firmly. "She say give to someone who need protection. You cross river alone, you need this." Annie felt tears prick her eyes. No one had given her such a meaningful gift since her parents died. Carefully, she slipped the cord over her head, feeling the weight of the stone settle against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll always keep it." Naya smiled, satisfied. Then her expression grew serious. "Annie, I hear things too. My father, the other men, they talk. Not good." A chill ran down Annie's spine. "What things?" Your people want more land. My people say no. Naya's eyes were worried. Some young men in my village very angry. They say fight before all land taken. Annie bit her lip. She'd heard whispers too, among the men in town. Complaints about missing tools, accusations of stolen livestock. Some blamed wild animals, but others pointed fingers at the native tribe. Just yesterday, she'd overheard Mr. Cooper and the blacksmith talking about forming a group to drive those savages farther west where they belong. Has there been trouble before? Annie asked. Naya nodded slowly. Long ago. Before we born. Big fight. Many die. She looked down at her hands. My grandfather, he died then. Annie reached out and took Naya's hand. I'm sorry, she said softly. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the river's constant flow. Annie thought about the adults in town, about the way they spoke of Naya's people with fear and anger. If they knew she was here, that she'd made friends with a savage, they would forbid her from ever coming to the river again. But how could Naya be a savage? She who had taught Annie which berries were safe to eat, who laughed at Annie's stories, who brought her a protective stone because she worried about Annie crossing the river alone. If only the townsfolk could see what Annie saw when she looked at her friend. Annie, Naya said suddenly, breaking the silence. You know both sides now. You understand my people, not what your people say. Maybe you help? Me? Annie stared at her friend. How could I help? I'm just a kid. Nobody listens to me. You listen to me, Naya said simply. You saw me, not enemy. Annie thought about this. It was true. She had seen past the warnings and fear to find a friend in Naya. But could others do the same? I don't know what I could do, she said honestly. But I'll try to think of something. The sound of voices in the distance made them both freeze. Men's voices coming from the direction of the settlement. Annie quickly gathered her things. I have to go, she whispered. Tomorrow, same time? Naya nodded, already moving toward the trees that would hide her path back to her village. Be careful, Annie, she called softly before disappearing into the shadows. Annie hurried along the river path, her mind racing. As she neared the settlement, she saw a group of men gathered outside the general store. Mr. Cooper was there, and the blacksmith and several others. Their faces were grim as they talked in low voices. She slowed her steps, trying to appear casual as she walked past. A snippet of their conversation reached her ears, missing since yesterday. Probably those Indians took it. Time we did something about them. Can't have savages stealing from decent folks. Meeting tonight. Bring your rifles. Annie's blood ran cold. She clutched the stone pendant through her dress, thinking of Naya's warning. Things were worse than she'd thought. Much worse. That night she stayed with the Tanner family, lying awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Through the thin walls of the cabin she could hear men gathering outside, their voices a low murmur she couldn't quite make out. The occasional clink of metal told her they had brought their rifles just as they'd said they would. Were they planning to attack Naya's village? The thought made Annie's stomach twist with fear. She had to warn her friend to tell her people what was coming. But how? She couldn't sneak out now with so many people awake and moving about the settlement. Tomorrow, she decided. She would go to the river first thing in the morning and hope that Naya would be there, or that she could find a way to reach the village on her own if necessary. It would be dangerous. The men would be watching the paths more carefully now, suspicious of any movement in the forests. If they caught her trying to warn the enemy, they might never let her stay in Willow Creek again. But as Annie finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her hand closed around the smooth stone pendant. She thought of Naya's trust in her, of the friendship that had grown between them despite all the reasons it shouldn't have. Some things were worth the risk. In the morning, Annie would cross the river again. This time, she would be carrying something far more important than a ribbon or a cookie. She would be carrying a warning, and perhaps a chance for peace. Annie woke before dawn, her heart pounding with purpose. The Tanner household was still quiet, everyone lost in dreams. She slipped from beneath her borrowed quilt and dressed quickly in the darkness, her fingers fumbling with buttons and laces. The stone pendant felt cool against her skin as she tucked it safely beneath her dress. Outside, the world was painted in shades of gray. Mist clung to the ground like a thin blanket, and the trees stood as silent witnesses to her escape. Annie moved carefully, avoiding the creaky porch step and sticking to the shadows between buildings. Dogs barked in the distance, but no lights appeared in windows. The settlement slept on, unaware of her mission. As she passed the general store, Annie froze. Two men sat on the porch, rifles across their laps. They were keeping watch, just as she'd feared. She pressed herself against the wall of the nearest building, hardly daring to breathe. How would she get past them? A cat darted across the road, chasing some unseen prey. The men's attention shifted, following the animal's path. Annie seized her chance, darting behind a water barrel and then around the back of the next building. Heart hammering in her chest, she kept moving, not daring to look back until she reached the edge of the settlement. The path to the river stretched before her, dim in the pre-dawn light. Annie hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. No one followed. Taking a deep breath, she plunged into the forest, moving as quickly and quietly as she could manage. The river appeared through the trees, its surface misty and mysterious in the early light. Annie hurried to their secret meeting place, but Naya wasn't there. She hadn't really expected her to be. They usually met in the afternoon, but disappointment still twisted in her stomach. She would have to find the village on her own. Naya had never told her exactly where her people lived, only that it was where the sun sleeps, which Annie understood to mean west of the river. She had no map, no clear path to follow, only her determination to warn her friend. Annie crossed at their usual spot, the cold water seeping through her boots. On the other side, she hesitated. Dense forest stretched in all directions. The trees packed so closely together that in some places she could barely see a few feet ahead. How would she ever find the village? Then she remembered something Naya had taught her. "Always look for signs," her friend had said while showing her how to track rabbits. Broken branch, footprint, place where grass is flat. These tell story of who passed. Annie scanned the ground, looking for anything that might indicate a trail. At first she saw nothing but undisturbed forest floor. Then a few yards away she noticed a thin path where the ferns seemed pressed down. It might be nothing. A deer trail perhaps, but it was the only lead she had. The path, if it could be called that, wound through the trees, sometimes disappearing altogether before reappearing yards later. Annie followed it doggedly, marking her route by breaking small branches or turning over rocks so she could find her way back. The sun began to rise, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that dappled the forest floor. How long had she been walking? An hour? 2? The settlement would be awake by now. People would be looking for her, wondering which house she had wandered off to for her day's chores. Would anyone connect her absence to the planned attack? The thought made her walk faster. A sound stopped her in her tracks, voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Annie crouched behind a fallen log, peering cautiously through a gap in the bark. Two men stood in a small clearing ahead, boughs slung across their backs. They wore leather clothing similar to Naya's, with intricate beadwork decorating the edges. Their faces were painted with red and black stripes that made them look fierce and strange. These must be hunters from Naya's tribe. Annie's first instinct was to hide until they passed, but then she remembered why she had come. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, hands raised to show she carried no weapons. "Hello?" she called, her voice shakier than she'd intended. "Please, I need to find Naya." The hunters whirled toward her, reaching for their bows with lightning speed. One of them shouted something in their language, his voice sharp with alarm or anger. Annie couldn't tell which. She took a step backwards, suddenly realizing how foolish she'd been. Of course they would see her as a threat. These men didn't know her, didn't know about her friendship with Naya. "Please," she tried again, fear making her voice high and thin. "Naya, I'm looking for Naya." The men exchanged glances, their bows still drawn and aimed at her. One of them said Naya's name, his tone questioning. Annie nodded eagerly. "Yes, Naya, she's my friend." The girl with the hurt leg. Recognition flickered in their eyes at the mention of Naya's injury. The older of the two men lowered his bow slightly and said something to his companion. They seemed to be arguing, their voices growing more heated. Finally, the younger hunter shrugged, though his expression remained suspicious. The older man motioned for Annie to follow, his bow now lowered but still in his hand. Annie hesitated. Was she walking into a trap? But what choice did she have? The settlement men were planning an attack. She had to warn Naya's people, even if it meant putting herself at risk. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, Annie followed the hunters deeper into the forest. They moved quickly, forcing her to jog to keep up. The trees began to thin, and soon Annie caught glimpses of structures ahead, hide-covered dwellings arranged in a circle around a central clearing. The village was smaller than she'd imagined, maybe 20 dwellings in all. As they approached, people stopped what they were doing to stare. Women paused in their work, children clutched at their mothers' skirts, and men reached for weapons. Annie had never felt so visible, so obviously out of place with her pale skin and settler's clothing. The hunters led her to the center of the village, where an older man sat outside the largest dwelling. His long hair was streaked with gray and deep lines etched his face. A cloak of animal fur draped his shoulders despite the warm day, and a staff decorated with feathers and beads leaned against his seat. Even without being told, Annie knew this must be the chief. The hunter spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Annie. The chief listened, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he studied Annie for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through her. Then he spoke, his voice deep and measured. Annie didn't understand his words, but his questioning tone was clear. Before she could try to respond, a familiar voice called her name. "Annie!" Naya limped quickly from one of the nearby dwellings, her face a mixture of surprise and alarm. She spoke rapidly to the chief, who Annie now realized must be her grandfather or another elder relative. Then she turned to Annie, switching to English. "Why you here?" "Not safe." "I had to come," Annie said urgently. "The men in town are planning something bad. They think your people stole something and they're angry. Last night they had a meeting with rifles. I heard them say they were going to do something about the Indian problem once and for all." Naya translated for the others, her voice growing more distressed with each word. The village erupted in a flurry of activity and raised voices. The chief silenced them with a single gesture, then spoke again, his tone commanding. Naya turned back to Annie. "How many men?" "When they come?" "I don't know exactly," Annie admitted. "Maybe 10 or 15. And I don't know when, but soon. Maybe even today." More urgent conversation followed as Naya translated. The chief issued orders and people began to move with purpose. Some gathering weapons, others hustling children toward the forest edge. "My grandfather, thank you for warning," Naya said, taking Annie's hand. "But now you must go. If your people find you here—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Annie could imagine what the men of Willow Creek would think if they discovered she had warned the enemy. "Come with me," Annie pleaded suddenly. "You could hide at the river until it's safe." Naya shook her head firmly. "My place is here with my people." She touched the pendant hanging around Annie's neck. "You have protection. Now go before too late." "But what will you do?" Annie asked, tears pricking her eyes. "Will you fight?" Naya looked toward her grandfather, who was deep in discussion with the village hunters. "I not know. Grandfather must decide. Some want fight, others say leave this place, go farther west." "Fighting will only make things worse," Annie said, thinking of the rifles the settlers carried. Naya nodded sadly. "I know this. But some men not listen. They say we lose too much already." A shout from the edge of the village interrupted them. A young man ran into the clearing, speaking rapidly and pointing back the way Annie had come. The chief rose to his feet, suddenly looking taller and fiercer despite his age. "They come," Naya whispered, her face pale. "Your people already on way." Panic erupted in the village. Women gathered children, elders hurried toward the forest edge, and young men reached for bows and spears. The chief's voice rose above the chaos, issuing commands that brought order to the confusion. Warriors formed a line at the village entrance, their faces grim with determination. "You hide," Naya urged, tugging Annie toward one of the dwellings. "If they see you here—" "No," Annie said, surprising herself with her firmness. "I won't hide." An idea was taking shape in her mind, desperate and frightening, but possibly the only way to prevent bloodshed. She clutched the stone pendant through her dress, drawing courage from its solid weight. "Naya, I need to speak to your grandfather now." Naya's eyes widened, but she nodded, leading Annie quickly to where the chief stood with his warriors. The old man looked down at Annie, his expression stern yet curious. Naya spoke rapidly in their language, gesturing to Annie. "Tell him I have a plan," Annie said. "Tell him I might be able to stop this, but he needs to trust me." As Naya translated, the chief's eyebrows rose. He studied Annie for a long moment, then asked a question. "He want know why he should trust child from enemy village," Naya explained. Annie met the chief's gaze steadily. "Because I trusted Naya when everyone told me her people were dangerous. Because I crossed the river when it was easier to stay on my side. Because I'm here now warning you when I could have stayed safe at home." The chief listened to the translation, his weathered face thoughtful. Finally, he nodded once and spoke again. He say, "What is your plan?" Annie took a deep breath. "I need to go out alone to meet them. I need time to talk to Mr. Cooper before anyone starts fighting." The idea sounded foolish even to her own ears. Why would grown men listen to an orphan girl? But it was the only chance they had. The chief considered her words, then issued orders to his warriors. They looked unhappy but lowered their weapons slightly. "He say you have until sun touches treetops," Naya said, pointing to where the morning sun hung above the forest. "Then his men must protect village. It wasn't much time." Annie nodded her thanks and turned to go, but Naya caught her arm. "I come too," she said firmly. "Naya, no. Your leg." "Two voices better than one," Naya insisted. "They see us together. Maybe they listen." Annie wanted to argue but knew there wasn't time. Besides, Naya was right. The sight of the two of them together might make the men pause long enough to listen. The chief said something to Naya, his voice grave. She nodded solemnly in response. "What did he say?" Annie asked as they hurried toward the village entrance. "He say be brave like our ancestors," Naya replied, "and that his heart walks with us." The warriors parted to let them pass, their faces a mixture of doubt and hope. Annie felt the weight of their gaze as she and Naya stepped onto the forest path. Never in her life had so much depended on her. They moved as quickly as Naya's injured leg would allow, following a different path than the one Annie had taken earlier. This one was wider, more clearly marked, the main trail to the village. "They be coming this way," Naya explained. "We meet them before they reach village." Annie's mouth felt dry with fear, but she kept moving. The stone pendant seemed to grow warmer against her skin, reminding her of Naya's words. "It protect the one who wear it." She hoped the protection would extend to them both today. They hadn't gone far when they heard the sounds of men moving through the forest, branches breaking, voices murmuring, the occasional metallic click of a rifle being readied. Annie and Naya stopped, looking at each other with wide eyes. "Ready?" Annie whispered. Naya nodded, squeezing Annie's hand once before letting go. Annie took a deep breath and called out, "Mr. Cooper?" "It's me, Annie." Silence fell instantly. Then came the sound of hushed, urgent conversation. "Annie?" Mr. Cooper's voice finally responded, wary and confused. "What in God's name are you doing out here, girl?" "I need to talk to you," Annie called back. "Please." "It's important. Get back to town right now. These woods aren't safe." "I'm not alone," Annie said. "I'm with my friend. We're coming out, so please don't shoot." Before she could lose her nerve, Annie stepped forward, tugging Naya gently beside her. Together they rounded a bend in the path and came face to face with the men of Willow Creek. There were about a dozen of them, all armed with rifles or hunting knives. Mr. Cooper stood at their head, his face going from concern to thunderous as he spotted Naya. "Annie, get away from that savage right now," he ordered, raising his rifle slightly. Beside her, Naya stiffened but held her ground. Annie stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between Naya and the rifles. "She's not a savage," Annie said, her voice trembling but clear. "Her name is Naya, and she's my friend." Murmurs ran through the group of men. The blacksmith spat on the ground. "Friend or not, these Indians have been stealing from us," he growled. "Tools gone missing, livestock disappeared. Time they learned a lesson." "What if they didn't take those things?" Annie asked. "What if it was something else?" Mr. Cooper frowned. "What are you talking about, girl?" "The missing tools, a hammer, an axe, and some nails, right?" Annie had heard them discussing it outside the store. "And Mr. Tanner's calf?" "That's right," Mr. Cooper said slowly. "How did you—"